can watch while they kasher their house for Pesach and while they cook and jog and do whatever they do, whatever y'all do out there.
No driving.
Wonderful.
No driving. Do not drive.
Don't drive during it too much. Yeah, thank you. So thank you for joining us, and we're excited to enter Pesach next week, next Saturday night, and we have the great opportunity to prepare for that in thinking about some of our timeless religious ideals, ethical ideals, and how they relate to a major contemporary and ancient problem. And we're here with a master teacher, Rabbi David Almog, who lives in Yonkers with his wife, Lisa, and their 2 children, and teaches at the Academy for Jewish Religion, a graduate of YCT Rabbinical School. He served as campus rabbi at the Columbia Barnard Hillel and is currently working on his PhD in rabbinics at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. I had the great privilege of being a chavruta of Rabbi Almog's, studying a study partner of his, studying Buddhist texts in the Hillel some 15 years ago. And 15 years ago. And then we've continued that study partnership on and off throughout the last 2 decades. And it's great to be able to share a friend and a teacher with folks here. He has slides he's going to show, and also he's going to post one more time in case you joined this late, some slides where you can tap into that if you want to save those or look at those in a different way. So, hi, Rabbi Gerson, thanks for joining. We thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to pass over the floor to Rabbi Almog.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shmuley. Thank you. The chavruta has been amazing for me and just a real touchstone in my life. And I want to thank the organizations involved in this also, and both for giving me this opportunity, but also for being a good segue, because pluralism and social justice are both, I think, really characteristic of who we are and where we are as a community, at least within much of America. And I'm going to get to that. So I want to start first by putting my intentions on the table. My program today grew out of a desire to find a religious application for the ideas that were discussed in many of our Jewish institutions last summer. After the killing of George Floyd, many of our communities began discussing racial justice with renewed vigor. And I want to explore what that means Jewishly. One of the main concepts that we discussed is that we are often blind to challenges other people face, precisely because we do not face them ourselves. In other words, privilege blindness. Now, I personally most strongly connect to Torah and Judaism through study and teaching of texts. So that's where I'm going to take my exploration. But I recognize that this is a crowd with diverse connections to Judaism, and some, also have different understandings of the concept of privilege blindness. So your approach may be different. And I'll say this a couple times, take from it what you can. I also have to confess that my motivation is a bit reactive. I don't want to go into detail here, but I felt that too many of the responses from the rabbis within the broader American Jewish community were disappointing. I was surprised particularly by the resistance to the idea that a vulnerable minority would fear and distrust the authorities or question the sincerity of well-meaning outsiders. It was at odds with many of our own historical experiences, including many Jews living in the world today. That pushed me towards a different question. So, was there a relationship between privilege blindness in America and how we approach our own historical memory as Jews? Does it affect how we view our sacred traditions, which, as we know, testify to quite a bit of trauma? Was I missing something in my own Torah study? So just one more apology, one more caveat. A lot of what I share today comes out of broad readings of many texts and ideas, influenced by too many of my teachers to name. Similarly, I'll use broad brushstrokes to depict aspects of our history and our communities, which all deserve more subtlety and refinement than I can give them. So again, please take what works for you. And also, I'd love your feedback. This is a work in progress. And finally, I have a lot of material to cover, but I promise you there will be time for discussion and questions at the end. And if it seems I'm getting too close, just shut me up and let's just have conversations. Okay, so I want to first be very simplistic about this, where we are. For many Jews living in Europe and America, an enticing possibility opened up in the modern period, and that was fundamentally reconciliation, right? Reconciliation with our non-Jewish neighbors. By that, I mean something particular. I mean the integration into society while living fully as Jews, but also as equal citizens. And I know that's not going to be equal everywhere, of course. But what I mean is that the society doesn't maintain any obstacles, significant obstacles to participating and benefiting from its institutions just by virtue of the fact that we're Jewish. To me, that's how I'm fundamentally defining it, and I'm sure we can all nitpick on different points, but I think you get the idea. The Torah teaches that we should have the same law for the Ezrach and the Ger, for the resident and the stranger. And what I think was being offered to us in the modern period was for us to no longer be strangers, but to actually have some of the rights of Gerim. And I recognize that to our sorrow, we discovered that not everybody was as sincere in their offer of reconciliation. I recognize that. But for many of us, we live in places where we do know that there was some sincere form of reconciliation. So I first want to just talk about three different communities, one of which is ours. The first two communities is, I'm going to say, represented broadly by what we call ultra-Orthodoxy, although not limited to them and not complete, and certainly not descriptive of everyone who's ultra-Orthodox, and also of Zionism. And again, these are thoughts, these are ways of thinking that I think appear in these communities strongly, that believe reconciliation was either impossible or undesirable. But in America, I think most of us have embraced some measure of reconciliation, and that will manifest very differently in our movements, in our communities, in our families, ask your local rabbi, type of thing. But mostly we are comfortable and we feel a certain sense of comfort. We're cautious. We have the Shoah. We learned we have to remain vigilant. We know Pittsburgh's happen in our day. I'm sure a lot of you here have personal stories of anti-Semitic incidents. I know I do. And I know to succeed in America, we had to advocate for ourselves in multiple ways. But we know we have partners of good faith on the other side. And when I say other side, I also want to recognize that that includes, for many of us, in our own families. That's the community that we're in. And that's true even in the Orthodox world, although perhaps not as broadly accepted. We've been able to forge alliances, educate non-Jews about anti-Semitism. Leading Christian institutions have taken active measures to address anti-Jewish imagery in Christian religion. We haven't avoided community leadership. We haven't avoided political leadership. We really see ourselves as Ezrachim, as citizens, and not Gerim. And one of the things that has come out of that is that we feel responsible for our fellow citizens. We're no longer as parochial or insular, right? If we look even just internally religiously, and this is an example that, this is just one example. After 9/11, how many of our synagogues started not only saying a prayer for the US government, which many did, many synagogues started introducing prayers that were less internally focused, prayers for the US government to be a good government for its own people and not just to be good to the Jews. And we saw proliferation in communities that were more insular of prayers for US armed forces and things like that. On the flip side, we have organizations like Ori L'Tzedek, who see social justice as a religious, as a religious commandment and something, and a responsibility as a resident. So I guess with all of that, what I'm basically saying, to sum up, is that we are reconciled to some degree. I'm not making any broad theological claims about the future. I'm not saying Messiah is coming or not. Those are for the movements to decide. And I'm glad we're in a pluralistic environment, so we can, we can accept that about each other. But we basically were reconciled. Of course, there were costs to this process. And one of the well-known costs is tied closely to the history of the movement. Because so many of our traditions and our texts reflect this experience of galut, of being second-class citizens, of having to be in places where the non-Jewish society at large was not interested in reconciling with us, that creates a sense of dissonance. Many of those texts simply don't speak to us because they don't reflect our current reality. I also want to recognize there are many other reasons apart from reconciliation why people feel alienated from our texts and traditions. But reconciliation is surely one of them. Of course, there is another cost, which is that the society we reconciled ourselves to is far from perfect. And in truth, that has a lot to do with the history of movements as well, at least in some ways. So, for example, in the United States, we can be blind to the effects of institutional racism. And let's think about, just for a moment, our denominations were often defined by suburban communities that developed in a time of severe housing discrimination and redlining. I also just 2 weeks ago, I learned, I didn't know about this. I didn't know that the over 1 million Black World War II veterans were largely denied GI Bill benefits. There were about 500,000 Jewish World War II veterans, and of the ones of those who were not also Black, that's also another part of our community that we don't speak about enough, but I have to wonder how many of them face that same discrimination and how that might have helped us in our building our own communities, what that benefit, what that difference might have made. So to sum up, many of us, myself included, embrace our citizenship in this largely non-Jewish country as a positive part of who we are, despite the constant and tragic reminders that we are still vulnerable. But we know we have caring allies and support from American institutions. We also know that there are costs, both to alienation from within our own traditions and also reconciling with a society that has many of its own sins that we need to collectively address. So first of all, I know it was a mouthful. Any questions on that point, clarifying questions?
Yes, Rabbi, I do have a question. My name is Ari Anderson. I work for Arizona Jews for Justice with Rabbi Shmuley. So I just have a quick question about what you were mentioning about prayers for the U.S. government in synagogue, which I've always found really problematic because I think that inches really close to nationalism,
right?
Which is, we as a people have suffered at the hands of nationalists for eons. So it doesn't make much sense to me when I see people doing it themselves. Like, I don't really like that we have flags in synagogues. Sure. So where do we go from that? And how do we, continue to be in support?
That's a good question. I will say at least within, I wasn't making so much of a prescriptive claim. I wasn't saying whether or not this is what we should or should not do. And and I think that's a larger conversation. What I was describing, though, was the very fact that we are doing that shows that we think of ourselves as something more than strangers. That we see ourselves as responsible, even if the particular way in which it manifests is not how our different groups or our different synagogues or different families might approach it. It's a good question, I think, for another time. All right, I'm going to start with the slides. Thank you, Ari. Let me. I have to share screen, so just give me a moment. Or if you want to, the links that I gave have have many of the slides there as well. Let's see. I put a Google Slides link, even though I'm using PowerPoint. Okay. All right. So I want to start with what I'm doing again, just to repeat that I'm trying to find a religious approach, not just something that both speaks to me Jewishly as somebody who loves studying texts and loves our traditions, and that directly addresses issues of privilege blindness and what that means for us today. So with turning to our sources, of course, I'm starting with 4 questions. The Haggadah enthusiasts here might be interested to know that I originally only had 3 questions, but later versions of this talk, I changed it to 4. So just to repeat, what the 4 questions are: who is the one remembering? What are they remembering? Is it a personal memory? And why are they remembering it? So I'm going to turn to first slide. Can everyone see? Right. This is from Exodus. For context, it happens right after the death of the firstborn and the first Passover night in Egypt with the blood on the doorpost and all of that. Of note, in the previous section, God tells Moshe and Aaron to make the Passover rituals into a zikaron, a memorial for future generations. Moshe describes it in personal, intimate acts of storytelling between parent and child. Moreover, God talks to Moshe and Aaron again and tells them to have one law for the local and one for the stranger. But Moshe here in this chapter in Yud Bet and 12 and Yud Gimel, he never mentions that. He never brings up the idea of, well, you were a stranger, so you should treat strangers well. That he doesn't bring up here. So give me one second. So if you just take a look, I'm going to also just cut to the next slide so you can have a look at that. Just take a moment. Okay. So I want to start first with verse 2. Verse 51 is just for context, but verse 2, this is the only thing God says to Moshe at this moment, at this moment. All he says is, consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast. The first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. And if you jump to verse 3, you're kind of expecting Moshe to just say the same thing, but Moshe ends up couching it. He gives this big description. So I want to talk about that just for a bit. Moshe gets that God is saying that Bnei Israel are now free from Egypt, but bound to God. That's generally the explanation of how most of these rituals work. We're bound to God, right? He understands God performed a miracle culminating in the plague of the firstborn. God's first decree after freeing them is to claim a right to their firstborn, which sends multiple messages. And one of them, you're bound to me, but it isn't just a mercenary claim. And for the human child, it's just symbolic. Anyway, so just want to get that out there. The point is that we are all equally bound to God. None of our families, none of your families has more of a claim on a relationship to God than anyone else's. We're all equally bound by the legacy of the 10th plague. So Moshe's response, which begins in verse 3, is him realizing that God is essentially creating a ritual of memory, and he has to explain that to them. So it's the first thing he says, remember, zachor. Right. So I'm going to ask my questions now. So who is remembering? We see 2 groups. The first group that's remembering is the Israelites living in this time. They were the ones who were enslaved, who are just being liberated today. The other group remembering are their future generations. And so for one group, it's a personal memory. For the other group, it isn't. And what they're remembering is the day they went free, but also that God took them out with divine might. Right? And I would say what they're remembering is also they're being told to memorialize it. One of the things I think is very important is that the word zachor is used here. The root often is also to mention. Memory is not simply a private personal act, it's also a public act. It's an interactive act. And that's true for all of us, at least according to most studies I've seen. So in this case, the generation of the Exodus is memorializing Passover, creating events for later generations to recall. And why? Well, one, to know that God is powerful, and God used that power to save them so that they're bound to him. But perhaps also that God is powerful enough, and I think to look at that God is powerful enough to actually fulfill the promises, bring them to the promised land. And that they have to pass it on to future generations. And as I said before, though, Moshe here does not mention anything about being a stranger, even though God explicitly says it in the previous chapter. So let's turn now to a bit later in the book of Exodus. This is in Parshat Mishpatim. Just to give you the chronology, it is presented right after the giving of the Torah. So I'm just going to read these. You shall not wrong the stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me. And my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. And then the next chapter, we read, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, vatem yadatem et nefesh hager, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. So here we have the same former slaves being reminded of their personal experiences of slavery, not memorializing the day of liberation. Neither of these texts notably use the term zachor. And in fact, later when it mentions Chag HaMatzot, the idea of creating a memorial isn't mentioned there either, and the future generations isn't really mentioned at all there. In Exodus 22, they're simply reminded they were strangers. But I think the psukim that follow suggest that they're being reminded of the event of the Exodus itself, that God is powerful, and that God listens to the cries of the oppressed and fights for them. You were strangers, you were vulnerable, and look what happened to your oppressors. Don't make me save them from you. Right? In Exodus 23, however, it's somewhat different. They're being reminded of their experiences. This isn't God flexing the divine muscle. This is God asking for empathy. So it's a different argument, but both of them together are using the experiences, the personal experiences that they had in order to treat those who are strangers, who are more vulnerable, well. It's just giving two different reasons, sort of an inherent reason and an external threat. Give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to leave the book of Exodus and jump to Leviticus. I know I'm skipping a lot. I'm skipping the explicit commandment to love the stranger in Vayikra, so you have to bear with me. It's a lot of material. Additionally, Sefer Dvarim, where I'm skipping to, it repeats the memory of Egypt all over the place, and there's a lot of places that I would love to look at, but we can't. But just for a little bit of context, Dvarim, Deuteronomy, is essentially Moshe's last will and testament. Right? The children of Israel had been in the Midbar, in the desert, for 40 years. The generation of the enslaved has completely, has died out, except for two people, really, and Moshe. So they're about to go into a land. And I want to say, the important thing, according to me, is they're about to go into the land free and with a certain amount of power, which means they also have the ability to abuse that power. So if you look, I put at the bottom of this page these two verses that basically say the same thing, and it's actually repeated in several places in Dvarim. This verse, V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. Right? Remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And it is always given in the context of laws that either address the creation of social safety networks or the inclusion of more vulnerable or less people with less access, including them in things like celebrations. I want to be clear. I am not saying that these are ideal societies, but what I am saying is that Moshe is constantly reminding them, remember, your ancestors were slaves in Egypt. Therefore, make sure that you are taking care of and addressing the needs of those who are vulnerable, just like you were. The main text, which I'll just read quickly from Deuteronomy 16:3, is one you should recognize from the Haggadah. You shall not eat anything leavened with it for 7 days thereafter. You shall eat unleavened bread, the bread of distress, the lechem oni. For you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, b'chipazon, so that you remember the day of your departure from the land of Israel, from the land of Egypt, from the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. So first, let's figure out who's remembering. So as I said, it's the Israelites who did not experience slavery themselves. And they're remembering the day God took their ancestors from Egypt, but also from context. And you could see this verse, one verse comes in the section, in the parak immediately beforehand. And the other verse is really the end of this section about the holidays. And you see it's also not just about the day, but about the bitterness, the memory of the experience. Note again that here zacharta is used, whereas in Exodus it was not. But also note that the same rituals of remembrance are used. In fact, the psukim that just precede this one are about offering of the firstborn, which, as I said, is one other reminder. So I could end here, by the way. I could say, why remember? I think I can neatly explain it, right? Their lack of personal experience is the very reason for remembering Egypt. The Torah understands privilege blindness, and it creates opportunities for us to remember historical oppression, precisely because it knows we're at risk of forgetting. So it reminds people of God's might, of course, but that just reinforces the point. And there are other things it does. It undermines aristocratic notions of class. You are descended from slaves too, just like we saw with the firstborn. You are descended from slaves too, so you're no better than those who are struggling in your society. You don't have any birthright to it. I would also add that in the context of Devarim, we have the concept of vehalachta b'drachav, of walking in God's ways. So God frees the oppressed, so should we. So there are many more verses in Torah that I could give to spell out this notion, but just because we can talk about identifying that distance between the generation entering into the land of Egypt, into the land of Israel, and the generation that left Egypt, doesn't mean that will actually help us overcome privilege blindness. It just gives us a reminder to do it. But additionally, it's also not the end of our history. There's so much more that happens, and especially within biblical history. So with that, I want to turn to two texts from the prophets. And again, I know I'm skipping a lot. All right. So one text is from Isaiah. I want to be clear, the texts I'm taking are from Isaiah, Yeshayahu, and Yirmiyahu. And they are both big fans of helping and supporting people who are facing persecution, or they're big fans of it. But what we see is they unlink the memory of Egypt from that. They don't really mention the two together. So let me first read Isaiah. Thus said the Lord, who made a road through the sea and a path through mighty waters, clearly referring to the Exodus, although perhaps some other stories, who destroyed chariots and horses and all the mighty host. They lay down to rise no more. They were extinguished, quenched like a wick. Do not recall what happened of old, or ponder what happened of yore. I'm about to do something new. Even now it shall come to pass. Suddenly you shall perceive it. I will make a road through the wilderness and rivers in the desert. And then in Jeremiah, you see a sort of similar thing. See, a time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up a true branch of David's line. He shall reign as king and shall prosper, and he shall do what is just and right in the land. In his day, Judah shall be delivered and Israel shall dwell secure. And this is the name by which he shall be called. The Lord is our vindicator. Assuredly, a time is coming, declared the Lord, when it shall no more be said, as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, but rather, as the Lord lives, who brought out and led the offspring of the house of Israel from the northland and from all the lands to which I have banished them, and they shall dwell upon their own soil. So both of these are examples of nechama, of consolation, the promise that once again, God will save us. The concern here, however, is that the Jews are currently facing conquest and exile. So quickly, what is being remembered? Well, there are two types of events, old events and new events, neither of which have been experienced by the people involved. The old events are simultaneously being remembered, but they're also being forgotten. Meaning Isaiah is both intentionally vague, and both Isaiah and Yirmiyahu, they both imagine a time when the future miracles will make us forget. Wow, you thought Egypt was good. When the Mashiach comes, forget it. You won't even remember it. So I want to add just one thing. I think that both of these texts, both of the prophets, the Nevi'im, are very sensitive to a question that was likely being asked during the exile of their days. In particular, it's explicitly stated at the beginning of Yirmiyahu, where is God? Right? So in fact, the memory of Egypt is not as strong now. They have to wonder, where is God? Yirmiyahu's asking it. And I think that that's kind of hidden. That's kind of, that's implied by these sources. The story of the Exodus must have sounded hollow to them. And I think the Nevi'im understood this. Of course, as I said, neither of these sources makes a connection between the memory of Egypt specifically, and therefore you were strangers, you should treat strangers well. You were slaves, you should treat those who are serving you well, which seems to be, which is a very common idea in the prophets, the idea of taking care of those in need, but it's not mentioned here. I think what we are seeing from these texts is that the effectiveness of everything done למען תזכור, in order to remember Egypt, both for its miracles and for its bitterness, is contingent. It changes based on historical context, the freedom and persecution. And we can really trace that out if you wanted to. And perhaps I could end here as well, right? If it's contingent, then we'll look at our situation. We have this cautious reconciliation where we are not gerim, but ezrachim, even if vulnerable. So, however you slice it, we have enough confidence, enough privilege in America to bring back this Torah model of remembering you were strangers and slaves. To me, though, that isn't yet the religious response to privilege blindness that I want, although it's a very good justification, and it gets a lot of good social justice work done, and there's some lovely themed Haggadot that go along that topic. None of what I'm saying so far is particularly new either. I want to say that I'm just trying to describe what it is as I see it. When we get to the rabbinic period, and here I'm going to stop the screen share for just a second. When we get to the rabbinic period, the context changes again. We lost the temple again. Jews have been crushed in military rebellions multiple times, experienced horrific persecutions under the Romans. And the rabbis, as scholars demonstrate, showed a very pragmatic but defiant pacifism. And it's mirrored in many of the Jewish communities today. So I would love to go through the entire Haggadah and show you how that is. If you give me one moment, though, I'm going to just pull up one text that I think is truly it's truly an American tradition. You'll tell me if you recognize it. Just one more second. So this is truly an American tradition, the Maxwell House Haggadah. I don't know, maybe I'm dating myself, but for certain generations, everyone had the Maxwell House Haggadah. So I'm going to give the Haggadah on one foot, because I wish we had more time, but to summarize, the Haggadah says, please come and sit down, my children. We say, what? Why? Can't get it to change the page. All right, maybe I won't do this. I'm just going to read what I have to write. We'll have to imagine the Haggadah. Well, it's really important that we talk about the Exodus because we were slaves and God took us out of Egypt, and we should tell the story, and we should tell it a lot. And it doesn't matter how much we think we know about it, we must tell it. There were these great rabbis, they talked about it so much, they stayed up all night. People used to argue, do we have to talk about it once a day or even twice a day? Are we going to talk about it even once we get out of this stinking exile? And when we say everyone should talk about it, we mean everyone, no matter how good or bad your aptitude or intentions are, right? And we especially do it on Seder night. But why? What are we remembering? Well, we're remembering that God said we would be slaves and come to our rescue, and that's exactly what happens. And in fact, that's one of the central points of Haggadah. We raise our glasses and we say, in every generation, someone tries to kill us. God saves us. Let's eat, right? And that's essentially the Haggadah. Now, more happens, of course, right? We say, not only is it essential to our history, in fact, if we go back to the beginning, Lavan tried to destroy us, and that was even worse than the Exodus, which, by the way, we haven't even started talking about yet, even though that's the holiday that we're supposed to be talking about. We know fundamentally God was there for us and has saved us repeatedly. And as many steps as we give to this is what our suffering in Egypt was like, that's how many steps of miraculous amazement we were given. That's how much we moved. God was there for us. So fundamentally, we are free, and we have to see that in every generation and keep the hope alive that one day God will free us from this exile. Now, one thing about it, though, that you have to be crystal clear is the Haggadah goes out of its way to say it was God. It wasn't, and many scholars will talk about Christian polemics, it wasn't somebody else doing it. It wasn't through a medium. But what I think one thing that's important about it also is you also have to imagine that the Jews living under Roman occupation when these texts were first being put together also want to make it very clear that they're not interested in being revolutionary. It is God who will save us. It is not our own hand. Now, with one arguable exception, which is actually on the page I'm sharing now, which is halach ma'anya, the Haggadah doesn't link the memory of Egypt to social justice. You say halach ma'anya seems to be the exception. But even then, that line you could argue. It does say it. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't connect, social justice to the Exodus, but the Exodus, the Haggadah and the rabbis, I think, are quite aware of the fact that the memory of Pesach is just not as strong a link in order to bring us to loving the ger. It has a different purpose. It has a purpose of giving us hope. And in fact, what I want to add is I think it has a purpose that is the inverse of privilege blindness. If there's a blindness that privilege causes is we're not experiencing it, on the other side, there is the lack of hope. There's the lack of opportunities and options, the inability to see a way out of your persecution. That is a different kind of blindness. And that in a certain degree, I think we can say that the memory of Pesach as it's being used for those Jews facing persecution who have to look inward, it is precedent for our liberation. It has happened in the past. God has saved us. For those of us living in times where we feel like we can be Ezrachim, where we have, whether it's free in our own land as described in the Bible, whether it is in the land of Israel today, however it is understood, if we feel that we are Ezrachim and has a responsibility, then the memory of Egypt is there to help us overcome that blindness. But as I said, the sages are quite aware of the fact that the memory of Egypt doesn't seem to work as well as it once did. So I'm going to go back to my sources. So I'll screen share again. I think I have to go. Here we go. So I'm going to read through this quickly. One should recall the exodus of Egypt at nighttime. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, "Behold, I'm around 70 years old, and I did not merit the explanation the exodus of Egypt be said at nighttime until Ben Zoma explained it and said, in order that you remember the day you left the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. The days of your life teaches the daytime. All the days of your life teaches the nighttime. And the sages say, the days of your life teaches in this world, all brings it to the days of the Messiah." Just so you know, the story continues, doesn't end there, just like what we read in the Haggadah. The conversation actually continues. It was taught in a Breita. Ben Zoma said to the sages, "But will the exodus from Egypt be mentioned in the days of the Messiah? Was it not already said?" And this is our Yirmiyahu quote, "Assuredly a time is coming, declares the Lord, when it shall no more be said, as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, but rather as the Lord lives, who brought them and led the offspring of the house of Israel from the northland and from all the lands to which I banished them." They said to him, "It is not that the exodus from Egypt will be uprooted from its place, but that subservience to the kingdoms will be, meaning the exile, will be primary, and the exodus from Egypt will be secondary to it. Similarly, you say, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but instead Israel shall be your name. It is not that Jacob will be uprooted from its place, and indeed the Torah still calls him Jacob, but that Israel is primary and Jacob secondary to it. So too, do not recall what happened of old, or ponder what happened of yore. Do not recall what happened of old. This is the exile, the galut, the subservience to kingdoms. Or ponder what happened of yore. This refers to the exodus of Egypt. I'm about to do something new. Even now it shall come to pass. Rav Yosef taught, this refers to the wars of Gog and Magog, which actually are both travails, but also end the subjugation of the kingdom in rabbinic thought. Now it's a long source, but I think it's important to read this part. A parable, to what does this compare? To a man who was traveling on the road and a wolf attacked him and he was saved from it. And he would keep telling the story of the wolf. A lion attacked him and he was saved from it. And he would keep telling the story of the lion. A snake attacked him and he was saved from it. He forgot the story of the other two and would keep telling the story of the snake. In a similar manner for Israel, the recent woes caused the earlier ones to be forgotten. So I want to point out just two things about this text. In the debate between the sages and Ben Zoma, neither side believes the exodus of Egypt will remain as the core memory of the Jewish people. The sages believe it will become secondary, while Ben Zoma believes it will be fully forgotten. The next thing I want to point out, though, is that the sages also put a spin on Isaiah. It isn't the new miracles that were so amazing that made us forget the old ones, right? It's the suffering that made us forget the early sufferings. You know, the Midrash, I think, here catches that the real forgetfulness was the result of the persecution, that they couldn't remember Egypt and hold on to that faith because where was God now? And it also, I think, suggests that the level of the miraculous is determined by the persecution and the level of the persecution. So in our law, and I'm going to wrap up here and give an option for how to go from here. So I'm almost done with the main part. In our larger discussion, it deeply reflects the way oppression influences hope and the understanding of what is possible, as I said. But we are dealing with the same distance, only from the inverse direction. Today, we're dealing with the distance from the point of view of reconciliation and freedom, the concerns of privilege blindness. But we have thousands of years of woe that have made us forget the exile. So which raises the audacious question, and it's not what I'm actually suggesting, don't worry. But if there's a serious goal of overcoming privilege blindness, then is Egypt the memory we need to be using? Especially since in our day, we feel more distanced from both the miracles. You know, we don't see the active hand of God. Whatever you believe about the active hand of God, we don't see the splitting of seas today. And we're also very distant from the enslavement, from the slavery. So I'm not telling you to throw away your Haggadot. It's clear. And I'm not suggesting we stop talking about the Exodus in our daily prayers, nor am I suggesting we stop connecting the Exodus to social justice either. I think it's still a totally valuable memory to use. But what I am suggesting is that something I think a lot of our communities already do. The Shoah, for example, that has taken center stage for us in our understanding of Jewish persecution. And we've already created rituals around it in many of our communities. And it's certainly galvanized many people to take action on behalf of those who are facing genocide and other types of persecution. Haggadah itself places exile and genocide at the center of its discussion, making the Exodus secondary. And many of these thousands of themed Haggadot push both aside. So, but then you might ask me, right? Wasn't this the problem I started with? Alienation. Isn't that it? Aren't we getting alienated from these texts, pushing them aside? I think the answer is, I'm not saying push it aside, but I also think it isn't the same thing. Those texts that are jarring to our sense of reconciliation, and they're real some of them are ones that we dedicate whole classes to, right? Troubling texts and things of that kind. They're often our best testimony for our own experience of trauma, and it has been memorialized, just not necessarily in the places that we have traditionally memorialized suffering in order to invoke action and social activism. Right? If we think of Egypt as the focus, we don't necessarily look at a text of the Mishnah that's talking about something totally different, but which contains very serious reflections of a community under trauma, under oppression. We tend to just confront those texts, right? So I one thing to say, that there are texts, and if we have time, we have 10 minutes, and so what I really want to, I'm going to end here. Just want to say just what the approach that I'm suggesting is that we can remind ourselves of, we have constant reminders of our experiences throughout our textual tradition that are a rich resource for us to use. And I actually think that we need to actively approach those texts with an oppression lens. I know a lot of people will say that's too much, or they don't want to go there. There are many other reasons. There are many other reasons to study Torah. This shouldn't be the only one, but I think that it would be a waste for us to look at these texts as if we were coming at it from purely a question of reconciliation. This text says something offensive about our neighbors. Yes, we need to recognize that. But there was a reason the rabbis in the time wrote it, what trauma they were under, and it should not keep us from encountering it and engaging with it, and not just simply for therapy, even though that's good too, but to look and say, this is our memory. We have to remember that we went through this, and therefore to help us recognize it in others. Now, there's the one last point, is that doesn't necessarily get us out of the problem. Because as much as it means we need to be listening to it, we still suffer from the privilege blindness. What if we don't see it? And clearly, God, who sees and hears our suffering, I actually think that that's what the main, that's the explanation of God's response. If you think of the ancient world, when the God in Gilgamesh, the gods destroy humanity because they're too noisy. God gets upset at noisy people too, but in a different way. God hears the noise of the oppressed, the cries of the oppressed. And if it gets so loud that God can hear it, then God's going to come down and make sure that it's quieted by helping out the oppressed. So really, the mitzvah that I'm pointing at is we have to hear the oppressed before God does. But how do we do that? And that I have to just share from personal experience. I won't go into all of them, but just as I begin to listen more closely to descriptions of Black people in America, of their experiences, something changed for me religiously. And I began to recognize the similarities of their descriptions, not to just our general historical like knowledge of persecution of Jews, but specifically to what Chazal, to what our rabbis were talking about, the issues that they had. Now, I'm not saying that the texts are the same or that the intentions are the same or that they're the same genre, but I don't think I need to say that. I think we can find a blog post or an article or anything and still put it in conversation with our textual tradition and still get a lot out of it. I think that instead of doing the kind of textual archaeology that we often do, where we find the three words, we have a Hasidic text written by somebody who really was afraid of Gentiles and hated them, who talks about it in his texts, but who also has amazingly brilliant ideas of compassion and things that we can draw from. Instead of just doing the archaeology and the surgical removal of the trauma involved, to encounter it and see, well, how does that affect the way in which this text talks about persecution? How does that affect the way in which they talk about oppression? And when we see the voices and hear the voices of those who are dealing with perhaps different kinds of oppression, but ones that are similar enough that we can put them in dialogue, I've only found that it helps. So that took longer than the 30 minutes I'd given myself. I have an example of it that I can share, or we can ask questions on this, but we only have 10 minutes, so I don't know if we can do both. So
why
what
don't
do
we
you
open
guys
up
say?
the floor? Yeah, maybe good to open up the floor now, and you can conclude with that if that works for you.
Sure.
Okay, who wants to jump in here? Questions or comments?
Rabbi David, that was so good. Thank you so much for that. I think that's something that we have seen is that trauma can trickle down and be passed on through generations and generations. And for a lot of us looking at Pesach, we go back into that trauma, right? But do you believe that compassion can also be passed on through generations and generations? Therefore, how do we ignite that compassion aspect of our thought and our belief and transform that into empathy?
Right. So it's a great question. And I think that is one of the ways in which I'm describing. I think that, first of all, what gets passed down as the Torah is describing it is the methods in which we are celebrating our freedom. That's one of the things. It's not just, we don't just use Pesach to remember that we were oppressed. We also use Pesach to remember the ways in which we went free. And while in our tradition, which is based off of this time where reconciliation was not an option, they're thinking of the defiant ways. God's going to take out our enemies. And just, I'll give an, like we say, many people say, shvoch hamatcha, like, pour out your wrath. A lot of people don't say it because it doesn't fit within our worldview. But, the opening the door for Eliyahu, I think the most likely historical explanation is that they were checking to make sure anybody was there listening before they said all of these psukim that basically show that God's going to take out, our vengeance upon those who oppress us. So in that mode, we're only looking at the insularity, but I kind of imagine what would the Haggadah have been like for that generation about to go into the land of Israel? What would the Uri Litzedek of that, who was, Shmuley Yanklowitz of the desert, if he were to write the Haggadah, of the Midbar, what steps would he use? And perhaps if going into the land of Israel had worked out the way it was supposed to in the biblical text, again, I recognize not everyone takes these stories literally, but if it had worked out, what would it have looked like? And I think that the way in which our experiences get passed down have to take that into account. I don't know if that fully answers your question. I think that answers the part to say that the empathy still gets passed down. The methods can still get passed down. But the flip side is even within communities that don't experience reconciliation, it still gets passed down. It just might not get passed down in our texts in the same way. These are texts written by leadership, right? This is text written by the people who have to stand. So they aren't necessarily, they're thinking about what are my community needs. And I just sat there last night with Reverend Dr. Evelina Huggins, who's a Zionite minister, and her community is not big into interfaith work. But she was telling the stories of, well, some people in our community are like, no, we have to be insular. Like, we're not involved in these conversations. We have our own issues. But that doesn't mean that the people actually on the ground aren't still empathetic and still applying the compassion that they need to apply. So it's a long answer. I'll try to keep my second answer shorter. Any other questions?
Who wants to jump in here?
Oh,
Jordy.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I think it's fascinating that we often use memory to, the way we talk about memory is that it can be a good thing, that it's always a good thing in Judaism, right? That it's supposed to spur us toward social action, at least in the Reform movement that I grew up in and that I'm, rabbi in. But this idea that memory can also be a liability and that can make us too focused on our own experience and callous toward other experiences because we've so centered our own experiences in this hierarchy of suffering, which makes it hard for us to see what's in front of us. So I want to thank you for that, because it really problematizes for me the way that I've been taught the uses of memory in Judaism. So thank you. And I don't know if that's a question, but if you could speak more on it, that would be amazing.
It's a great observation. The way we use memory is so different depending on circumstances, and the same memories can be used for totally different things. And I think here we see an example. In one case, it's used as a way to help us get out of our, to help us work through our trauma. In another case, it's used to evoke sympathy or empathy. So I think it's a great observation. But I think the point is you have to keep studying it. You have to keep thinking about it and realize that the memory is doing something. The memory is there for more than one thing.
Because if we use it to justify abuses of power because we're living in our trauma, right? I'm not gonna get specific, but I see this a lot with my congregants who are like, well, anyway, yeah, but
No,
I will get specific. Israel is justified in doing anything they want because we have this history, this Jewish history of trauma. And so we should always look out for number one, so I just think it's fascinating, and it's a really important, if we take this idea of memory having a claim on us seriously, we have to think about it as expanding our empathy and making our empathy even more radical and challenging us. So I just thank you for that. It was really, really thought-provoking.
I think we have 2 more minutes.
Time for another question here before Eddie wraps this up. So Rabbi Almog, you had a closing thing you want to share. Do you want to do that?
Sure. Just I want to. I don't know if 2 minutes is really enough time. I want to share actually a text that might be triggering. So maybe I shouldn't with only 2 minutes. I mean, I can try, but I'm going to go for it anyway, and I'll trust people understand that this isn't what I believe. Here. Here we go. Okay. Waiting for it to actually show up on my it's not showing up. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't here. So I'll share. There is here. I'm going to just try sharing my screen one more time, and then if that doesn't work, then I guess I'll just say goodbye. Here we go. Okay. So this is an ancient text, the Tosefta. It's from the Tannaitic period. It's written by Jews who were in Roman Palestine suffering under occupation, but after, it's after rebellions. And it's one that I think a lot of Americans here will bristle at, right? One should not prepare food neither for feeding Gentiles nor for feeding dogs on Yom Tov. And we know what the signs and the history are. Now, immediately we could contextualize and say, well, this isn't a sign. This is internal speech. And this is from people who really had reasons to mistrust their neighbors. What I did though, and I don't have I wish I could show you the whole thing. So in just the 1 minute that I have left, there was just a blog post from the Huffington Post that I was shown years ago called "Invitations to the Cookout Have Now Been Rescinded." Now, I'm not saying it's the same text, and I don't want to diminish the author of this text or the authors or our sages by making any unnecessary comparisons. But if you have the chance afterwards, read through this and take a look at what is the woman who's writing this? Who does she see? What does she see herself as? Is she a gatekeeper for this community? And in what ways? And who does she see as the gatekeepers? And what are their anxieties? And when you compare it to the text here, here's the whole text with "do not feed," the whole with the offensive rhetoric. It's about not inviting Gentiles on Yom Tov. In this case, it's about not feeding them on Yom Tov, but it's also about who it is who's acting as a gatekeeper and the need for intercession when the authorities come into play. And here, I'm giving it to you in one leg. I think that this is two approaches to accommodating when there is no interest in reconciliation, right? When it isn't, what does it mean to accommodate? And in this case, the authorities, when you're actually, when you have to live in fear of them. And many of the similarities you'll see there are similarities between the descriptions here and also later halakhic text and the blog post that I just set out, and many other conversations about what does it mean to have a Jewish only space or a Black only space, and who are the allies and who are the people that we invite in, and why do we fear and mistrust, and how much does that have to do with the authorities? Because a lot of it does. So I think I gotta let you go because it is definitely past my time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi David Almog. It's always a pleasure to learn Torah with you, and just like as we said in the beginning, I mean, anytime we can link in Torah and social justice, it's just a pleasure. So I appreciate everybody who's on the call. Thank you so much for joining us. Huge shout out to Rabbi David for this from our amazing organizations, Tzedek and Arizona Jews for Justice. We thank you so much. Everybody have an amazing day. Take care.